So I want to know who's going to give me that look when I go back to my seat after my sermon. You know that Tamar could be very critical. She had high standards for herself and for others, but she was as loving and supportive as she was sometimes critical. And so I cherished that little glance that she would give me when she would tell me that I did an okay enough job. And I sensed that even when I hadn't, she gave me that look anyway. Once, a couple of years ago, I gave a sermon that was particularly emotional, and when I got back to my seat, Tamar gave me this big hug, and she wouldn't let go. The hug just went on, and I guess it still is. So a few weeks ago, I was talking to Sue Resnick about my upcoming, summer sermon, and Sue reminded me of the 7-year rule. I didn't know what the 7-year rule was. My mom raised me with the 10 miles an hour rule, but that was a different rule. So Sue explained that the 7-year rule was if you have a sermon that's more than 7 years old, you can get away with delivering that same sermon again. Well, I got 40 years worth of sermons on my hard drive. And so it occurred to me that maybe today I should speak about the Ten Commandments in view of the recent legislation in Louisiana, which requires the display of the Ten Commandments in public schools. I have a Ten Commandments sermon. It's a Rosh Hashanah sermon. It was a rather good one. So that's from 2003. So that was one possibility. One of my favorite sermons is one that I gave on the second paragraph of the Shema. That was from 2018, so that was a good one. This is Shabbat Nachamu. This is the Shabbat after Tisha B'Av. So what about a sermon on Tisha B'Av? This one began with the Alan Sherman lyric, but you don't know the lyric?
Which one?
Why did she go and fall in love? I haven't seen her since Tisha B'Av. But, that's sort of old hat, I suppose. What about Shabbat Nachamu? This is the Shabbat of consolation. So what is the healing of Shabbat Nachamu? Tisha B'Av and its seasons, and we're still in the season of Tisha B'Av, as we will be for another 6 Shabbat, for the next 6 Shabbatot as well. The Tisha B'Av season teaches us how to mourn. We learn from our model of national mourning how to experience bereavement and our own personal bereavement as a process of healing. Or to put it another way, our annual experience of national mourning teaches us about personal mourning, and vice versa. So, here's a good sermon on that, but Tisha B'Av is so last week, so I'm not sure. And by the way, did you really think that I wasted all that paper and all that ink just for a cheap laugh? I mean, not that there's anything wrong with cheap laughs, but...
You going to do all of them?
No. Now aren't you ashamed?
Yes.
So anyway, so I decided that I would speak today, not about Tisha B'Av and not about the healing and not about the second paragraph of the Shema, but I thought I would write a sermon for today about Kimberly Davis. Who is Kimberly Davis? She was the county clerk in Rowan County, Kentucky, who in 2015 refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples in defiance of the Supreme Court's Obergefell versus Hodges decision, and in so doing, she became the poster child for the recent perversion of the First Amendment notion of religious freedom to mean my religious freedom means my right to impose my religious perspectives on other people. And I've been asking myself in recent years, is there in Jewish law and Jewish values something to this? Can a Jewish county clerk, for example, who believes that Jewish law forbids intermarriage, refuse on the grounds of religious freedom to issue a marriage license to an interfaith couple? Well, my sermon on Kimberly Davis would have led to 2 conclusions. First, maybe. After all, lifnei iver lo titein michshol. On the other hand, absolutely not. Sorry, Kimberly Davis, or Chaya Sarah Davis, or whatever name you're going by these days. So that was going to be my topic for today, but then I started working on my Torah reading for this morning, the Ten Commandments. So how can I not speak about the Ten Commandments? So Kimberly Davis will have to wait for another sermon. You remember Judge Roy Moore? I'm not talking about Roy Moore and underage teenage girls. I'm talking about Roy Moore and the Ten Commandments. Well, actually, they are one and the same person, but you may recall that more than 20 years ago, Roy Moore was removed from his position as Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court for defying a federal court's order to remove the marble monument of the Ten Commandments that he had erected in the Alabama Judicial Building. Of course, requiring the Ten Commandments to be displayed in a government building is unconstitutional, and I guess the state of Louisiana hasn't gotten the memo yet. One doesn't have to be a constitutional scholar to have an informed opinion about why such displays violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Which version of the Ten Commandments should be displayed in Louisiana or some other state? The Jewish version, or the Roman Catholic version, or the Anglican version, or the Lutheran version? Of the Ten Commandments, which one of those 10 is the one about Shabbat? Well, according to the Jewish reckoning, that's the fourth. According to most Christian reckonings, it's the third. And it's not only a question of numbering, of grouping the Ten Commandments. What, for example, does lo tirtzach mean? According to most Christian translations, I believe, it means you shall not kill. But the normative Jewish reading of this important mitzvah is you shall not murder. There are, according to Jewish law and tradition, certain legitimate cases of homicide, killing in self-defense, for example, or in a just war. But the illegitimate killing of another human being is murder, and that's what the Ten Commandments prohibit. So displaying a version of the Ten Commandments that says, you shall not kill, or even thou shalt not kill, is displaying a non-Jewish version of the Ten Commandments. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Ooh, there's that pesky Establishment Clause again. But you know, displaying the Ten Commandments in a government building is inappropriate not only on constitutional grounds. And how do I know that? I learned that from Paul Tillich. So who in the world is Paul Tillich, some of you may be asking? Paul Tillich was one of the most significant Protestant theologians of the 20th century. He died in 1965, and when I first met him 8 or 10 years later in a religious thought class, Tillich absolutely blew me away. By the way, that's a theological term from the 1970s. Now, some of you who know me may well be able to guess some of the most significant theological influences in my life. Abraham Joshua Heschel, of course, Franz Rosenzweig, certainly Neil Gilman, and others. But Paul Tillich remains one of the most important influences in my theology, and therefore one of the most important influences in my spiritual life. I looked up the Wikipedia article a couple days ago, and I discovered that Tillich was born on August 20th. My dad was born on August 20th. So Freudians, knock yourselves out. Central in Tillich's theology, and central in my own, is his understanding of religious symbols and their function in our religious lives. So what are religious symbols? What do they do for us? Tillich has 4 points that I want to share with you. First, he taught, religious symbols point beyond themselves to something else. In the sphere of religion, Tillich wrote, symbolic language alone is able to express the ultimate. Second, symbols participate in the reality to which they point. They don't just stand for something, they somehow contain some of the essence of the thing to which they are pointing. We see this, by the way, with secular symbols as well. For example, a national flag participates in the power and dignity of the nation for which it stands. A flag is not just a piece of cloth. Think of how powerful an act of protest or how hurtful an act of protest is, the burning of a national flag. And a religious symbol participates in the holiness to which it points. The third characteristic of a symbol, Tillich taught, is that it opens up levels of reality which otherwise are closed for us. Many things in our reality, of course, we can perceive through our senses, but some things are beyond our perception, and symbols help us to experience them. And fourth, Tillich taught, a symbol unlocks dimensions and elements of our soul, opens up hidden depths of our own being. Well, Tillich actually wrote of 6 characteristics of religious symbols, but these 4 are sufficient for us for the moment. Just to review, religious symbols point beyond themselves. They participate in the reality of that to which they point. They open up otherwise closed levels of reality, and they open up our own hidden spiritual depths. Now, religious symbols come in different forms. Certainly, many objects, many things are religious symbols. Consider a Sefer Torah. Consider how deferentially we treat it. We stand in its presence, we dress it in royal garments, and we reach out to kiss it when it passes in procession. Because of its holiness, we're not allowed to touch the parchment of a Sefer Torah with our bare hands because of its sanctity. A Sefer Torah is a religious symbol. It points to the reality of its divine author. Its holiness is derived from God's holiness. It potentially opens, ever so slightly, the imperceptible holiness of God, and it potentially opens us up to our own spiritual depth and our spiritual growth. A person can be a religious symbol. A rabbi, a priest, a minister, or an imam is a religious symbol. Some of you might remember a recent sermon about the rabbi as symbolic exemplar. Moses was a religious symbol. Lahavdil, Jesus was a religious symbol. Our patriarchs and matriarchs were religious symbols, and they function as religious symbols as we tell the stories of their lives, as we share the lessons of those stories, even as we mention them in our daily prayers. Most powerfully, I think, a ritual act can be a religious symbol. And the performance of a mitzvah is potentially a religious symbol. Heschel called religious symbols sacred deeds. What is a sacred deed? Heschel asked. An encounter with the divine, a way of living in fellowship with God, a flash of holiness in the darkness of profanity, the birth of greater love, endowment with deeper sensibility. And ritual objects can be religious symbols as well. Think of tefillin, both the objects themselves and the act of putting on tefillin. When I put on tefillin on a weekday morning, following the recitation of a bracha that acknowledges God's command that I put on tefillin, I'm potentially connecting myself with God through the words of the brachot I recite and through the act of fulfilling God's commandment by putting on the tefillin. The ritual points to a reality that is beyond my perception, but it also opens up that imperceptible reality, and ultimately it can open up my own spiritual depth, or to put it another way, it can challenge me to plumb my own spiritual depths. And the tefillin themselves have great power, great symbolic power. When I put on my tefillin, they speak to me. B'chol levavcha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol me'odecha. You shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So religious symbols are good, right? Religious symbols, in whatever form they take, objects, people, ritual acts, stories, theological affirmations, they're powerful things. And I'm grateful to Paul Tillich for teaching me about the power of religious symbols. But there's a problem. Religious symbols point beyond themselves. They're a means toward a spiritual end. But when we lose sight of this crucial fact, when we start to see this or that symbol not as a means toward an end, but as an end in itself, then that symbol becomes something else. It becomes an idol. And last time I looked at the Ten Commandments, which was about 20 or 30 minutes ago, idolatry was included in the prohibitions in the Ten Commandments. So Tillich taught that the downside of the power of religious symbols is their idolatrous potential. And every religious symbol has idolatrous potential. And so we are well warned to watch our step, to be wary of the idolatrous potential of religious symbols at the same time that we revel in their spiritual power. So what's the difference between a good or valid religious symbol and an idolatrous symbol? To put it another way, what's the difference between the appropriate use of a religious symbol and the abuse of a religious symbol? These aren't simple binary states. There's no simple formula for differentiating the appropriate use of religious symbols from their abuse. But I think one helpful distinction comes from the realization that in order for a religious symbol to function properly, we have to properly engage with that symbol. It can't simply be displayed. Scrolls sitting in an ark, or plaques on a wall, or items in a display case are diminished religious symbols, or ineffective religious symbols. Many years ago, not long before my bar mitzvah, I heard Rabbi Skolnick give a sermon about tefillin. He reported a then recent experience in which he had been in a Reformed temple for a meeting, and he saw a Judaica display case, antique Shabbat candlesticks and Seder plates and so on. And in that display case, there also rested a pair of tefillin. Now, this was close to 60 years ago, so one could assume then that nobody was putting on tefillin in that Reformed temple. Now, I don't remember Rabbi Skolnick's exact words, but the gist of that next part of his sermon was, God help us if our tefillin become consigned to display cases. I learned from that sermon that tefillin belong not on display in museums, but on our arms and our heads. Their spiritual power belongs in our neshamas. So what of the politicians in Louisiana and elsewhere who think we ought to display the Ten Commandments in public schools? Should public school students engage with the Ten Commandments that are on display in their classrooms? Should they study the sanctity of the seventh day? And come to think of it, debate why the church moved the Sabbath to Sunday, the day of Jesus' resurrection? Or should they study Jewish and Christian concepts of marriage to more fully appreciate why the Ten Commandments tell us, lo tin af, you shall not commit adultery? No, the advocates of Ten Commandments displays in Louisiana and elsewhere where similar legislations are being pursued wouldn't have the chutzpah to advocate that degree of religious engagement in public schools. At least I assume they wouldn't. But if they're not advocating that, why are they fighting so strongly for simply displaying the Ten Commandments? I think Tillich would explain why. Paul Tillich would call that idolatry. Throughout my life as a Jew, I have loved Jewish rituals and stories and, of course, ritual objects. And thanks to Paul Tillich and others, I continue to grow in appreciation of the power of those religious symbols. It is because of this that I so object to the abuse of religious symbols when it occurs. Our job, I think, is to remain diligent regarding this abuse in the public square. The constitutional issues remain significant. But more importantly, I think, our obligation is to be open to the power of religious symbols, to understand their power to connect us to God and to our deeper selves, to cultivate our responsiveness to their spiritual challenges. Shabbat Shalom.